In the year 690 AD, something happened in China that had almost no precedent in the ancient world. A woman did not merely advise from behind the throne. She did not just rule as a widow, or manipulate a weak son, or dominate the court in secret. She took the imperial title for herself. Her name was Zetian, and more than 3,900 years later, she remains the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. But Zetian's rise was so extraordinary that later historians often wrote about her less like a ruler and more like a warning. To some, she was brilliant. To others, terrifying. And to many traditional chroniclers, she was something even worse. A woman who had stepped into a role they believed no woman should ever hold. Wu was born in 624 into a well-connected and relatively privileged family. Unlike many women of her age, she was educated. She could read, write, and navigate the refined culture of the Tang court, skills that mattered far more than people often realize. In Imperial China, literacy was not just a personal accomplishment, it was political power. As a young woman, she entered the palace of Emperor Taizong as a low-ranking concubine. At that stage, she was nowhere near the center of power. She was one among many women in an enormous imperial household. And yet somehow she did what very few people in history ever manage. She climbed. When Taizong died in 649, palace custom sent her to a Buddhist convent. For most women, that would have been the end of the story. For Zetian, it was only intermission. She returned to court and became attached to Taizong's son and successor, Emperor Gaozong. By 655, she had become Empress. That alone was remarkable. But what followed was even more extraordinary. As Gaozong's health declined, probably from chronic illness and strokes, Wu moved steadily from influence to control. By about 660, she was effectively making many of the major state decisions of the empire. China still had an emperor, but increasingly, it was Wu who governed. This is where the darkest stories begin. Later accounts accused her of murdering rivals, purging enemies, even killing her own child to frame another empress. These tales helped create the legend of Zetian as a cold-blooded monster. But here is the part people often miss. Some of these stories are impossible to verify, and some may have been exaggerated or invented by later writers hostile to the very idea of a female sovereign. Wu was certainly ruthless. Few rulers reach supreme power without being ruthless. But the image of pure evil may tell us as much about the men who wrote her history as it does about Wu herself. When Gaozong died in 683, Wu still did not surrender power. She ruled through her sons, removing one and then another when they threatened to act independently. Then, in 690, she did the unthinkable. She proclaimed a new dynasty, the Zhou, and crowned herself emperor, not empress consort, not empress dowager. That word mattered. Wu was not simply running the empire. She was redefining what supreme authority could look like in China. And despite the fear she inspired, her reign was not just a parade of cruelty. Under Zetian, the state became more centralized and more merit-based. She expanded the bureaucracy and relied more heavily on the civil service examination system, helping shift government away from old aristocratic families and toward officials selected for talent and learning. That was a major long-term change, one with effects far beyond her own lifetime. She also strongly supported Buddhism, using it both as a genuine religious force and as a tool of political legitimacy. Buddhist imagery and prophecy were used to present her rule as something cosmic, even destined. This mattered because Wu could not rely on tradition, so she built a new kind of legitimacy around herself. And here is another detail people often overlook. Zetian did not rule a weak or shrinking state. Her era formed part of the High Tang, one of the great peaks of Chinese power and cultural influence. Her government carried out military campaigns and maintained China's strength across a huge imperial system. Britannica notes that her rule helped consolidate Tang power and stabilize the empire. By the end of her life, however, age, factional struggle, and court intrigue closed in. In 705, she was forced from power in a coup. The Tang dynasty was restored soon after. She died later that same year, and perhaps the strangest final image of all is this. At her tomb stands a wordless stele, a great monument with no inscription. While the exact meaning is debated, it feels almost perfect for Zetian. A ruler so controversial, so ambitious, and so unprecedented that later generations could never quite agree on what should be written about her. Monster, reformer, usurper, genius. Zetian was probably all of these in part, and far too important to be reduced to only one. Because in 690 AD, she did not just seize the throne, she forced history to make room for her.